Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Erwin Balbol and I'm managing the social good team here in New York. And today I'm excited to introduce Douglas Rushkoff, who's going to talk about his new book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. Douglas is a writer, documentarian, lecturer whose focus is human autonomy in the digital age. And he wrote 15 best-selling books, did many award-winning documentaries. He was named one of the world's 10 most influential intellectuals by MIT. And he coined concepts like viral media or social currency. And when he's not giving talks at Google or somewhere else, he's a professor at CUNY Queens College. And today he's going to talk about his latest book and how growth became the enemy of prosperity. Please join me in welcoming Douglas.
Thanks. So is that human or is that Google?
Human.
That's human? Because it was very fast. I guess that's like a court stenographer person.
She's award-winning.
Is she? Yes. She's good. Hello. See, that's almost my whole, the whole thing I'm thinking about these days, is humans creating value, the ability of humans to create value in a digital age, and what happens when the humans are replaced. Why are we replacing certain humans with technologies and not others? When is it better? When is it not? And what's the real underlying philosophy? What's the underlying drive for doing these things? When I first started to think about this, when the human receptionist was replaced by a automatic answering machine at a law firm. I was temping back in the days when no one knew how to do word processing. If you knew how to word process, you could get $40, $50 an hour for typing at night in law firms. That's what we did in the late 80s. And there was this great receptionist I was building up the courage to ask out. And she got replaced before I had the chance to do it. And she was replaced with an automatic answering thing. And it was the primitive kind where you really, going through the menus was hard. It still is, but it was particularly hard back then. And I remember thinking about the savings. And I understood that the company was saving money by having a machine instead of a human receptionist they had to pay and give health insurance. But the amount of time it took everybody else who was calling into the company got vastly expanded going through all these menus. So the total cost, the total man hours and total corporate money that was being spent as a result of the replacement of the receptionist with the machine actually went up. The law firm just externalized, it's the corporate word, they externalized the cost of phone answering to the callers, which created a kind of arms race then. Then every other company has to do that. Everyone has to externalize. Otherwise now you're paying the price of their phone machine but not reaping the benefits of having your own. So everyone ends up externalizing these things. And in the end, I thought of that, and this was counterintuitive. This was anti-Harvard Business School, anti-General Electric. I thought of that as bad business. And still do, because now the company's customers have to spend more time, the company's shareholders have to spend more time to get shareholder information, which makes them angry. The suppliers have to spend more time. So it's costing more money to the financial ecosystem, if we are allowed to use that word anymore, talking about finance. The financial system in which the company exists ends up more stressed rather than more healthy. But if we have a corporate individualistic understanding, more of a military sort of strategy for the company, then there's no other way for things to go. In this kind of bastardized version of Darwinian selection, where you think that, oh, you've got to be the meanest company doing the meanest things and taking from other and all that in order to succeed. It's an infantile understanding of, we're seeing it on many stages today. You know, this a very primitive, childlike understanding of how business works. And I don't blame people so much for it as our inability to recognize the operating system on which we're trying to run our companies and do our work and live our lives. So when I first wrote this book, the original title was very optimistic. It was called Distributed, a New OS for the Digital Economy. And what I was arguing was that we could move from an extractive growth-based paradigm to a distributive circulatory one. I mean, in my shorthand, I would say rather than optimizing for growth and extraction, we optimized for the velocity of money. We optimized for the amount of transactions. So how do you really get the economy off the hard drive and into RAM when we're working on it the other way? I mean, that's sort of the underlying philosophy of this work, of how I'm seeing things. And the thing that got me the most upset, the most kind of agitated, was that developers, engineers, programmers seemed oblivious to the operating system on which their companies were running. That they accepted the underlying values as if they were pre-existing conditions of nature, rather than a very specific operating system that was developed at a specific moment in history with specific needs in mind, and that it might actually be obsolete in our current setup, and certainly in a digital age. So I would look at a friend like Evan Williams, one of the founders of Twitter, and see him on the cover of the Wall Street Journal with the number $4.3 billion under his face, which is the amount that he was worth the day of the IPO. And I would think, oh, this poor fucker. It's over. He's fucked. You know, and anybody who understands how this worked understood he was fucked, because Twitter, it turns out Twitter can only make about $2 billion a year. That's about their limit. And you would think for a 140-character messaging app, $2 billion a year is pretty good. Pretty good revenue. And you think about what you actually need to maintain that app. It's not that much, right? You use Amazon for servers, just rent, do whatever. It's not that. Once you've built that, it's not that. It doesn't cost $2 billion a year to maintain that messaging. It costs a whole lot less. You could reach sustainability and great profitability. But we know that once Evan's got $4.3 billion of investor money, he's got to return $400.3 billion, $430 billion. That these are investors who, even at the IPO, are expecting 100x or 1000x returns on a growth-based company. So now he's trapped. Now Twitter is a failure. Twitter has to do, what do they call it? It has to pivot. Twitter's going to have to pivot into being they tried, a video company, ad company, this company, that. They're going to have to pivot to something that can deliver that kind of growth. And if they don't, they get bought by Yahoo, I guess, and then Jack Ma or somebody buys that. And that's what this moment was about for me, the throwing rocks at the Google bus moment. It wasn't, a lot of people think I'm saying, oh, let's throw rocks at the Google bus. And no, I'm not saying that at all. Throwing rocks at the Google bus is this almost, is meant as a poetic metaphor for the situation that we've gotten in, for the enmity and the inability of our technology companies to actually create distributed value for lots and lots of people. The fact that Google, which, those of you who are old enough to remember, Google was two kids in their Stanford dorm room that came up with an algorithm to take down Yahoo. We all resented Yahoo in the early internet because Yahoo was using humans and judgment and values to categorize the internet. This was a man-made hierarchical system. And Yahoo seemed invincible. And then this little algorithm, the idea was that now the links that, you guys know Google, right? The links that people make are going to decide in a bottom-up fashion behaviorally what how are we going to organize information? So it was this people-driven, bottom-up, democratic, populist reorganization of the world's information by how we use it and how real people think about it, rather than how some corporation decides to divvy it out in order to promote sales of things and existing worldviews and all that. They got it, right? That we're living in a kind of a tag cloud, and that this could be fun. And then what happens, though, is Google gets, I mean, we know Google gets all this investment, it becomes this giant corporation, then Google has to show a certain amount of growth. Google has to grow, and it has to grow at a weird, accelerating, giant rate. So sure, they're based not even in San Francisco, but if you're going to be a Google programmer, where are you going to live? You're going to live down near the airport, or you're going to live in San Francisco and get on the bus and go down there. And as you know, people who lived in San Francisco their rents ended up doubling and tripling because not just of Google, but all the activity that was going on there. And then Google, in a appropriate way, said, look, we're putting so much traffic on the roads and all this pollution, let's do these buses so that we can actually make it easier, have less of an impact on this community, and get more hours of work out of our people, of course, because they're going to work on the way down and on the way up with nice Wi-Fi. And what happened is that, as we know, if you're in walking distance of a Google bus stop in San Francisco, your rent is 30% higher even than it would have been. So here are these people, their rent's gone up, the bodegas are out of business, the local shops can't afford their rent anymore, and they're looking at these buses coming in as if it's an alien invasion, right? Bringing these developers from the mothership. Right? And what they're experiencing is this company is getting much bigger, but their actual lives are getting worse. They're having to leave their town. And that's why, they see the private buses on a public bus stop, their rents going up, and these people who seem to be using, and a company that seems to be using San Francisco more as a Hollywood backdrop rather than as a place that it's actually invested in. You would think if a business is located somewhere that it contributes to the prosperity of that place. But here Google seemed to be more like a foreign corporation extracting value from this place and leaving nothing there. So when people started throwing rocks, it was at an Oakland protest, they started throwing rocks at the Google bus, I started getting, people were messaging me on Twitter saying, isn't this cool? Isn't this great? And I was like, no, it's not great. It's like, I know people you guys do too. I know people. Howard Rheingold's daughter was on one of those buses that got stuff chucked at it. He's a writer friend of mine. And the Googlers aren't to blame. I mean, most of the people on those buses, they just want to try to keep their jobs for 4 or 5 years before they burn out, right? You know what there's a lot of, what's the average time span for, I don't know, but it's hard. They just want, and so then you could blame you're going to blame their bosses for the way they make them work, or you could blame the CEO of Google saying, oh, look what the way Google's impact. The CEO's just listening to the shareholders who are going to sell the stock if he doesn't make the stock grow. And who are the shareholders? Some of the very same people that are lying in front of the Google bus, who have Google in their S&P 500 fund. So who is to blame? And I'm arguing that it's not a human is to blame or everyone is to blame, that we can exercise human intervention at any place along that chain, but at the same time, it's not the effortful acts of humans, but this obedience to an economic operating system that was invented by people who have long since left the building. And what I wanted to do, the project of this book, was to convince people that this is a very particular economic operating system. And the way to do that was to use the tools of the media theorist. Who invented it? When did they do it? And why did they do it? And what I found out was that this originated after the Crusades. It was right after the Crusades that all the soldiers came back to their towns in Western Europe because they'd gone to Arab worlds, found out all these other things, found new technologies, new systems. They came back to their towns in Western Europe and they erected the marketplace for the first time. It was an innovation from the Arab world called the bazaar. The marketplace, it was there 2 days a week, usually like Tuesdays and Thursdays, Tuesdays and Fridays. People would bring all the stuff they had made or grown and they would trade it with each other. Instead of just giving everything to the feudal lord or the vassal now, they started to trade in a peer-to-peer fashion. And when bartering wasn't enough, they developed local currencies, market monies, not big central currencies, little market monies that were usually invented in the morning and then expired by the end of the day. So these were more like poker chips. So we can look into the specific ones. There were a lot of different ones, but they got those from the Arab world too. And it was interesting because people never had money before. That money was for long distance trade, gold florins and things. Peasants didn't have that. They didn't have a means of exchange. So now they had a means of exchange and they started to get wealthy. This was the beginning of what later got called the burghers, the bourgeois, the middle class. The merchant class got really wealthy. And no, it wasn't the best of times. It was still the Middle Ages, and there were rats and death and, people beating you up. It was a little Game of Thrones-y, but it was the greatest period of economic growth that we've ever really seen, of organic, distributed economic growth. People started to work only 3 or 4 days a week. Women were taller in medieval England with the marketplace than they were at any time in history until 1980. Which is an interesting one. It's just one measure of the fact that these people were eating and healthy and doing well. The problem with it, of course, was that as the people got wealthy, the aristocracy got relatively poorer. These were families that hadn't worked in 10 centuries. They had always, it's true, these were the former feudal lords and now the proto-aristocracy. So what they did was they came up with 2 innovations, 2 core tenets of a new operating system to slow the rise of the merchant class. And you can look, this isn't just my interpretation. This is, look at what they read. Look at what they read, or what they wrote down about why they were establishing chartered monopolies, why they were establishing central currency. And this is the history that for some reason is not as celebrated as talked about as it should be. First invention they came up with was the chartered monopoly. The chartered monopoly was a rule, a chartered monopoly. It was exactly what it sounds like. So now one business is chartered by the king to be in charge of an entire industry, and everyone else has to work for that person. So whoever's the king's friend, let's say it's Erwin, you're a shoemaker, and you're my favorite shoemaker in all of my country. So now anybody who wants to be a shoemaker, you got to work for him, period. Or I'll kill you. I mean, we had swords and knights and people to do that. So if you're working for him rather than making shoes, what does that mean? Now, instead of creating shoes and exchanging the value you created, now you are working for him. So now this is really when employment was invented. The only people who were indentured by time before that were slaves. Now people knew that the normal way to work was for me to clock hours. So instead of selling the value I created, now I'm selling the time I've spent. That's when technologically, that's when the clock tower went up on the tallest building in medieval towns. Because now time was money. And the idea of the clock made it feel fair. It's really an hour. I'm not working longer. It's not taking his word for it. There's a clock to make it all fair. But it was fair what? It was fair monopoly. The second invention they came up with was central currency. They made all local currencies, all of these market monies were illegal. Now, if you wanted to have money in order to buy something, you had to borrow money from the central treasury at interest. Very clever idea, because what did that do? An interest-bearing currency lets people who have money make money simply by lending money. That was the point. It allowed the people who already had capital make money by lending their capital to others, because this was interest-bearing currency. The other problem with interest-bearing currency is not only do you have to pay, do you have to borrow it, but you have to pay back more than you borrowed in the first place. And if everybody's going to pay back more than they borrowed in the first place, what does that mean about the economy? Economy has to grow. Either that or you end up with a lot of bankrupt people who can't pay back what they borrowed. So interest-bearing currency demands, its bias is towards growth. And this worked well right then, because what was Western Europe doing? Growing. We were colonizing everywhere. Colonizing America, colonizing South America, colonizing Africa, trying to colonize China. As long as we were growing, that was great. So we had our great chartered monopoly, British East India Trading Company, Dutch East India Trading Company. We had them going out, taking over spaces, partnered with the monarchs and their gunships, and it all looked pretty good as long as we could keep expanding into other places, and that all finally came crumbling down around World War II, when these countries started to push back. When little brown people in brown places said, no, you can't just extract our value and enslave our people. Right? We're going to push back. So England gives up some of its colonies and all, and then Eisenhower, right after World War II, he's faced with this problem. How do we continue to grow as an economy without these developing nations to take over? We can have Bretton Woods and some trade deals and all that, and have everybody's money pegged to our money, but what are we going to do? And that's when Vannevar Bush wrote the famous essay, As We May Think, which most of us just think is this great description of computer technology. It's not just that. As We May Think is really an argument saying these tools of war can be repurposed to tools to build our economy, to tools of a civilization. And what was the idea was that even though we'd run out of physical territory, computer technology could create virtual territory, virtual surface area on the market, so the market could continue to expand. But instead of expanding physically, now we expand in terms of consciousness. That's why we moved into an intention economy. The new resource that we colonize is human attention, human time, rather than physical territory and resources, which we still, of course, have to go and extract. But what we ended up with then were digital businesses, if you will, from not just Google, and Google's really not the worst of it in some ways, because at least Google has the intention to be here 10, 20, 30 years from now. So it has to take a slightly different approach. Google is not flipping, right? You're not going to flip Google. It's kind of too big to flip at this point, right? I mean, Uber or somebody, they're still, but what sort of business model does this operating system engender? It promotes the Walmart model, which is just colonialism writ small. What does Walmart do? Walmart moves into a region. It uses its tremendous war chest of capital to undercut all the local merchants, to put them all out of business. That's good for two reasons. One, no one can buy anything anywhere else. And two, no one can work anywhere else. So now we can change the terms of employment so that if you want a job, you've got to work part-time for Walmart. And you don't get health care, and you don't get this, you don't get that. So slowly over time, the people who are working at or in a Walmart town have to go on welfare. The town gets poorer and poorer, and eventually, it takes about 15 or 20 years, the town goes bankrupt. And then what does Walmart do? Closes and moves to the next area and sucks their value out. I mean, that's the scorched earth approach of a company like that. That's the way they understand it. And as long as they understand the world to be infinite, it's okay, we can move into China, we move into India, we'll find other places, and then when that economy there is restored with that last place that we closed, we'll go back there and suck out the money again. That's the mindset. So when that mindset ends up informing businesses that are running on digital platforms, it no longer takes 20 years for that to happen. It only takes 2 years for that to happen. So you look at a company like, and it's not about being evil. It's just about adopting an operating system as the way to do business. It's just understanding it as the way things are. So you take a company like Amazon. So why does Amazon choose the book industry to go into first? Is it because Bezos and his friends just love books and they want to promote literature and help authors and publishers reach more people? No, it's because the publishing industry, I know this because I'm part of it, the publishing industry is low-hanging fruit. We are a motley, awful, non-growth, inefficient business. The brilliance of the book industry is we managed to hide the fact that we don't make money for the last 200 years. We don't. It doesn't. It's this little kind of just fudge it, get to the next book kind of industry. So why did they pick that? Because it was an easy one to take over. Because you could establish, it wasn't to make money with books, it was to establish a platform monopoly in books that could then be leveraged to another one and another one. Why did Uber pick cabs? because they want to stay in the taxi business because that's such a great industry that's going to really promote a multi-billion-dollar company? No. It's because cabs were the most inefficiently run, awful, slow growth, ridiculously barely sustainable industry, meaning it was ripe for takeover if you've got a war chest of capital. So the poor guys, if you're driving a car for Uber, what are you really doing? You are doing R&D for a robotic car company that you don't even own. Right? You're making your own job obsolete. That's the work that you're doing. And they don't really care. They don't care because, so you go in and you destroy the existing taxi economy and infrastructure. It doesn't matter if they can't make the long run money out of that. Right? They're destroying that market, just as Amazon destroyed the book market. You destroy the marketplace because you're just using it to leverage into another one. And that's the problem, is that we end up putting destructive, extractive corporate capitalism on digital steroids. And then you see how all this keeps going. You know, and it's not just a digital problem, it's a finance problem. As Deloitte showed in 2011, corporate profit over corporate size has been going down for 75 years. Think about that in terms of in terms of functions. Corporate profit over corporate size has been going down. What does that mean? It means that corporations are really good at extracting all the money from an economy, but really bad at deploying those assets once they have them. It's not just because they're stuck in some European bank account and they can't bring it over without taxation. It's that they're obese. It's that they're storing the money in fat rather than muscle. Right? They don't know how to actually do anything with the money. And that's because the OS that they're using is to extract money and store it in share price, rather than to think of how to create a healthy, living, ongoing circulatory economy. They would rather make $10 once than $1 10 times. They can't even conceive of the $1 10 times, because then you've got to keep letting go of the money to make it. They're stuck, like I said, they're stuck on the hard drive and not in RAM. And then you look at the way we deploy our developers, our smartest kids. They come out of Stanford, and what job do you take if you get out of Stanford? The highest paying one's going to be working for Goldman. And what are you going to do for Goldman? Are you going to be helping them use money to create value, to help them deploy capital in ways that are the most efficient for the development of an economy? No, you're going to write algorithms that help you extract money from the stock exchange, or write derivatives of derivatives of derivatives that help you compress time. Derivatives are basically abstractions of stock, which are abstractions of the marketplace. So you can do derivatives or meta-derivatives and meta-derivatives of that. And of course, the derivative market has gotten so much bigger than the real stock market that, you know, the New York Stock Exchange was purchased by its derivatives exchange. It was. A thing is what's been swallowed by its own abstraction. And that's the biggest business in the world now. You know, so what to do about this? I mean, this is what we can talk about in our conversation. I mean, I think what to do about this is to develop technologies that are optimized more for the velocity of transaction, for the velocity of money, rather than the extraction of capital. Traditionally, there are three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And right now, young developers in particular, as soon as they have a good idea, they go to the capitalist, who then becomes his new daddy figure or something. And they do everything in the name of capital and forget about the land and labor. And that's why we have a disenfranchised labor force. It's why we have are we still allowed to talk about global warming and climate change? And we have a climate that some scientists suspect may be changing. So I came up with some really simple ideas for what to do. I mean, let's call them principles. I mean, the first one is make them rich. Make everyone you work with rich. And Google is actually good at this in some respects. If you look at Facebook, you put your video up on Facebook and you pretty much charge you to show it to anybody, you know, beyond the 3 of your followers who actually are sent the thing. And they don't share any of the revenue with you. If you put a YouTube up on Google, what do you get? Do you get half the revenue, half the advertising? 15%? Is anyone? 45%. I mean, what is that? That at least is saying, okay, rather than charging people to share their content, at least we're going to include them. Because why is that smart? Because then you're going to get more healthy, good people making content. It's worth sharing it. It's not just to be nice. It's not to be weak and nice or to fall, to fall victim to socialism. No, it's about creating a working economy, then people can actually live and develop stuff. Another way to think about this is to look at the techniques or the strategies that family businesses use. Traditional businesses think about it, or traditional CEO or chairman will think, how can I extract enough money from this business in order to leave something for my grandchildren? Someone in a family business will think, how can I make this business so healthy that it will still be here spewing good revenue when my grandchildren take it over? And when you have a family business, then you start thinking about, well, what is the relationship of this business to its employees? My kids are going to the same school as my employees. If I'm an asshole to my employees, they're going to beat up my kid. There's that sensibility. I mean, it's obviously more complex than that, but that sensibility is the reason why, and nobody wants to share this data either, family businesses do better than shareholder-owned businesses in every single metric except one, and that is that shareholder-owned businesses grow faster during booms. They grow faster during bubbles. Other than that, or shareholder-owned businesses grow faster and they pop. Family businesses do better on every other metric. They actually make more revenue over the long term. They have more stability, they're better alpha and beta, everything. Another thing to look at is whether it's possible, and how could it be possible for a business to become a steady state business? It's what John Stuart Mill talked about actually back when, that an economy reaches a carrying capacity, and once it does, you have to start thinking about how do you maintain a steady state, this sort of an equilibrium state. How could a company, is it even possible for a company to reach a certain level of sustainability and then stay there? I did a talk for one of the, we'll just call it, one of the world's very biggest soft drink companies. And it was right after they did their shareholder rally thing, and then I came. And for the shareholder rally, they got the shareholders and the executives and the vice presidents all shouting 4.3, 4.3, which was the growth rate that they wanted to hit that year. They had banners coming down from the thing. And I got up there and I said, you guys are one of the 50 biggest companies in the world. If you need to grow at 4.3% in order to be okay, then we're all doomed. So how do you get to a steady state? I mean, and that's thinking now in terms of things like dividends, letting your employees work less. If you start thinking about land and labor as participants rather than just the people who've given the capital, then all of a sudden you can start to see, oh, we've gotten more efficient. Oh, there's ways to share the wealth and to sustain a company. But you've got to bring in different sorts of investors. Look at the way Unilever's talking to its investors now, saying, we're not going to give you that kind of growth. If you want that, go. It's scary, but those ones go and other investors come in. Ones who understand that in order to have a planet, we're going to have to think of another way to do this. I'm arguing that companies learn to experiment. You can't go to a company and say, oh, go from this company to be one of those kind of companies. But you can slip things in, call it public relations. Right, so I went to a bank and I was arguing that what they should do is rather than give say $100,000 to a pizzeria that wants to expand, why don't you give $50,000 to the pizzeria contingent on their ability to crowdsource $50,000 from their community? And then you can give them the tool, give them an app or something that lets them do that. And the way they crowdsource would be, if you give $100 to the pizzeria today, you get $120 of pizza at the restaurant when the expansion is finished. So now you've gotten a 20% return on your value, on your money in less than a year, and you've invested in your town, making your town better with that money, rather than in a Filipino mining company or something that's just going to destroy the planet with that money and give you less return. Meanwhile, the bank now is seen not just as the extractor of capital and value from the community, not just as the bank, but as a facilitator of local economic reinvestment, as someone who has an expertise in the flow of money rather than just a monopoly on the extraction and loaning of money, which is something really important for banks to be able to develop as we move into a world where people can't borrow money and where there's going to be some hopefully, a shift towards local economic activity. But you don't tell Chase, this is your new policy. You tell Chase, wouldn't this be an interesting thing to try in Lansing, Michigan for a 6-month period as a public relations thing and get MSNBC to come in and do something about this trial? They do little trials. When the little trials work, they swallow the company. Or they can. Remember GM with Saturn? That was a trial. And what if we're actually nice to labor and build good cars and, and have customer service? And it got so good that GM had to shut it down. That the people in regular GM got mad. The same way people at Delta got mad at Song Airlines because Song was doing all this stuff that Delta couldn't do. 5, think about what does it mean to be in a bounded economy rather than a infinite economy. There is no infinite economy. You can't externalize everything. Eventually, all the crap that they're burying in China, that turns out is on the same planet as us. All the workers there, the revolutions, the angry, the planet got small. There's no place to send stuff. The economy can't keep growing forever. It just can't. We can't keep folding in so much stuff. We'd have to all be, God knows what we'd have to do to ourselves to maintain economic growth all the time. We're consuming, we're working, everything we do is working somehow. When you unplug, it's almost a revolutionary act at this point. But a bounded economy, you would start to think more in terms of how can I get the same money moving around? And I got the idea from the US steel workers who in 2007, after the crash, they were looking for where to invest their retirement money to take their pension funds. And what they did with the pension funds was they invested it in construction projects that hired steel workers. And people got really upset at this at first, saying, wait a minute, are they allowed to do that? This is like double dipping. You're putting your investment money in a project that then's going to pay you back the money as salary? Are you even, of course they're allowed to do that. And then they thought, well, why don't we now triple dip? We'll invest our money in construction projects that hire steel workers to build old age homes for their own parents. Which they did. So now they're triple dipping, and it sounds illegal, but it's not. That's the way money works if you think of it as bounded. How do we initiate that boomerang effect in money? And the only way to really do that is to create some sense of boundary. And this is where, although misguided and mentally ill, this is where Trump's notion of nationalism actually does make some sense. That people do have an instinctual understanding that the global economy doesn't serve human beings in scaled communities. So they want to try to get, how do we get boundaries? How do we, nationalist boundaries are fake. What you really want are city-state boundaries. You want urban boundaries. Nationalism itself was a construct. The nations, those lines, those are not organic groupings of people. And a couple of the other things I'm looking at are platform cooperatives where workers own the means of production. What would it mean if Uber drivers owned the company rather than someone they don't know owning the company? Will Juno work in New York, which is really a platform cooperative version of Uber, hopefully. And currencies. I'm really interested in local and alternative currencies and using them for exchange between people. If money has gotten too expensive, then screw their money and if you've got people with needs and people with skills, they can begin to exchange value. They just need a way to keep track of it. And I don't mean Bitcoin, which is just digital gold. It is another scarcity-based currency. You could use the blockchain to, if you really don't trust people, you can use the blockchain to create a public verifiable ledger. But it's really much more Uber. Bitcoin is kind of an Uber currency. It is. But Bitcoin does not engender trust between people in new ways. Right? Bitcoin replaces, it substitutes for trust in a new way. So as I see it, and it's sort of as we try to evolve towards a more communitarian, social, peer-to-peer economic world, I don't see more substitution as really the way through it. But I mean, as you can tell, the whole argument I'm making, which is really my original cyberpunk argument of 1994, if anything, is we have to stop thinking of ways to optimize human beings for digital technology and instead look at ways to optimize digital technology for human beings. And the economy is really the main landscape that we're programming at this point, where we have assumed, we've internalized the values of extractive, growth-based corporate capitalism as a necessary component of the innovations that we develop. And it's not. It's just one way to make money. And there are all these other ways to make money. There's slightly more, all boats raise. But all boats raising is not this terrible thing. It's really okay for everybody to be happy. This sort of scorched earth competitive model does not work in a distributed digital economy. The effects of our causes are much too great. Right? We're all developing apps that are potentially high leverage points in entire economies. And that puts a different kind of responsibility on us to at least look at what is the economic impact of this innovation. Is this spreading wealth or extracting wealth? Is this making people rich or is it making people poor? Is it helping create circulation or is it taking money off the table? And when you start thinking about it that way, all of a sudden it's not like some crazy socialist Marxist insanity. It's actually more consonant with digital technology than it is a threat to what it is that we're trying to do. Okay, good. Thanks. I went too long. Sorry, but we get to talk.
All right. So we have 15 minutes. Got some microphones, some questions if you have, and I'm going to start by asking you some questions. I had a long list of questions, and I have to trim it down, so we'll keep to the tricky ones.
Yeah.
So you argue that we have to go local instead of global, and this is to increase the velocity of money. And now the problem is that there are some sharks, and you mentioned Walmart or whatever, we can go in this local economy and eat you alive. And you make a point, I believe, in your book that government has to step in at some point to make this work. So what concretely does government need to do? And if for whatever reason we're not too hopeful in our government abilities, what's the alternative?
Government can't step in and make this work. I mean, government can, especially because government is, as we know it, government and corporatism are really the same thing. They co-evolve, they moved together. What government can do is get out of the way. Right now, we live in a economic landscape that is regulated to favor those with capital. Look at our tax code. You are taxed low for capital gains, and you're taxed high for dividends and income and wages. What does that mean? It means that the person who works for a living is the sucker, and the person who has others working for him or just has his capital working for him, that's the winner. And that's the kinds of regulations we can change. But the regulations are so easily corrupted by the larger players. When I forgot which American toy manufacturer had lead paint on their Dora toys. They had red lead paint. They established a new regulatory commission to come up with new rules that will stop there from ever being lead paint getting to American children. And of course what they did was they invited government and then the 5 biggest toy companies in America to come to this meeting, and they come up with rules that say, oh, it's going to now you have to spend $40,000 of testing on any toy that you want to promote that you want to sell in America. Now, why did they come up with a regulation like that? Because it put every small player out of business. If you're making 30 trains a year, 30 little toy trains by hand, how are you going to do $40,000 of testing on that train? You can't, and each is one of a kind. So the temptation of regulation is for the players to use regulation to favor themselves. So I would say no, it's a matter of municipalities developing alternative mechanisms of exchange. The only reason why Walmart sells its stuff cheaper is because money is cheaper for them. Money is cheaper for Walmart than it is for you or me. But if we had our own money, it could be as cheap as we wanted it to be. I mean, no, we're still going to have to get some stuff. You're still going to need to get your iPhones and your what are they called now, the new Android phone?
Pixel.
Pixel? We'll talk about it. The Pixel, I guess they're saying it's a better camera with that, right? That's the idea. or something more visual. No, but your pixel, you're still going to get that. You're still going to need, little slave children in Africa to go and get your rare earth metals, and other kids in China to lose their fingers to make this stuff. I mean, so you still get to buy your big, abusive, international corporate stuff. But I think by inventing means of exchange between people and real places, I think it's more of a bottom-up phenomenon than it is something that government regulates. If we're going to lobby for anything, it's things like changing the tax code, doing things to make it less expensive to generate revenue.
So if we go local, and this is going to be progressive, right? Not everyone is going to go local overnight. So some places will still do the global game and the capital game and whatever. And today, some of the advances we make around healthcare or sending satellites, they are very expensive and require a lot of capital. So are we going to have a two-speed society where the people who do the sharing and live happily don't get to benefit from the advances of longer life and those crazy fast cars or whatever?
I think there's going to be two approaches toward longer life. Right? One approach toward longer life is living the kind of life where you live longer. Having eating organic, local CSA food, having a chiropractor or homeopath or naturopath in your world, a more sustainable maintenance, healthy way of living. Then you could live, on jet planes and traveling around the world, and luckily you'll make enough money to get chemotherapy and gene replacement, and you'll go about it that way. I think. So you will see a two-tiered world. I wonder who will actually live longer in such an environment. But in the period of the late Middle Ages that I was talking about, we had two economies that coexisted. You still had the florin. You still used gold and long-distance trade for things that you couldn't get, for spices, for gunpowder, for whatever it is that you got from faraway places. And you had local currencies that you used for your food, for your babysitting, for local things. It's just that so many things that could be supplied locally are now being supplied through big agri and big pharma and big unnecessarily. So it's a matter of creating a balance. I don't think you live in one world completely or the other completely. It's just a matter of shifting the balance a little bit. And digital technology actually promotes local activity more than it does national. The nationalism, the Brexit, the divisiveness that you're seeing are all products of the digital age. This is important media theory for anybody in the digital landscape to understand. Television was global. Television was the simultaneous, real, around-the-world satellite images of man landing on the moon and the Olympics. These were embracing. The peak of the television age was Ronald Reagan in front of the Brandenburg Gate on CNN saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It was about globalism. What's the digital age about? It's Donald Trump saying, "Let's build a wall. Let's divide our countries. Let's get out of the euro. What were we?" It's built on memory. That's why they always keep saying, "Make America great again. Remember when Britain was great?" There's always a sense of false memory of where things were, because this whole platform is living on memory. And second, it's because digital is discrete, not just ones and zeros, but you think of a Snap 2 grid. You're either here or there. Are you Mexican or American? Are you Canadian or American? Are you on that side of the wall or this side of the wall? That sense of individual, of divisiveness is actually more local than it is universal. I feel like there's that's what's being retrieved, and initially it's being retrieved in an infantile way, but we could do it in a more intelligent, articulated way later.
Let's take a question from the audience.
What would the proposition be to individuals and companies who are embedded in the current operating system? Is a new operating system something altruistic that's necessary for the good of mankind? Or is it something that's necessary because we've reached the limits of global scale? Or is this something where you can actually increase your profits by getting a 20% return on your dollar investing in local pizzerias at scale? Like, which is it?
I don't know which one it's not. Extractive corporate capitalism has reached its limit. It actually has. I mean, that's why I quoted the Deloitte study, that corporate profit over corporate growth failed. And so, Jack Welch and GE, when they realized we can make more money lending someone to buy a washing machine than we can selling them a washing machine, GE sold their appliance business and became more like a bank. And they did, and Harvard Business School, that's I think it still is, what they're teaching as how to do business, become a holding company. Like Google did, became Alphabet, become a holding company, buy and sell companies rather than do, internal technological innovation. But that reached its peak. So I think it's actually better business teaching companies how to return to revenue-based models, rather than what they're doing. I mean, the soft drink company, they were at that point, they were selling their most productive assets in order to show short-term growth on the balance sheet. So that's not a good long-term strategy. That's self-cannibalization at that point to show the growth. So, but it never plays to say it's altruism. Oh, this is good for the world. Oh, there might be a planet for your grandchildren to live on. No one wants to hear that. They don't. That's not my job. That's not my job, right? I do that at home. That's not my job. My job is to be, make money. But it's a lot of it's shareholder communication too. How do you communicate to shareholders that getting dividends might be better than just the growth of their stock? And the way to convince them that is to get the tax law changed on dividends so they don't hate them so much.
Christian?
Hi. So you mentioned a few times that you thought it would be good for people or corporations to optimize more for money moving around or circulating, but it's not immediately clear to me why that's a good thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with extractive corporate capitalism is if you take the money out of the economy, then the people, your customers, no longer have any money to buy stuff from you. So you want them to be able, Walmart's strategy of pushing people down to the poverty line in order to take all the money that's on the table ends up being a bad idea, because no one's going to loan these people money because they have no jobs, and they can't spend money because they don't have cash. So what I'm suggesting is that if companies circulated or thought of ways to circulate the money faster, they end up with just as much money coming through their toll booth, but they don't take it off the table the minute it goes through the toll booth. That the vacuum cleaner effect of an Amazon or an Uber destroys the marketplaces on which those companies are ultimately depending in order to have revenue, which is why Google, by helping to try to make video makers rich rather than poor, at least they have a model for a sustainable market rather than one that needs to get its money coming in from elsewhere.
Thanks.
The goose is the gold egg theory.
Yeah.
You keep the goose around rather than killing it once.
Right, and eating it. But you have to. If you've got to show 100x returns, kill a goose here, get out. I mean, will Travis be at Uber when it has its IPO? That's the question. There's a point at which you're playing flip this business. You have an idea from the dorm room. You bring it to the VC, and the VC says, now take that idea and pivot towards something that we can sell for 100 times what we just spent within 2 years. So you throw away that great idea. Think of all the great apps that got dispensed with because they had to do this one thing. That's what we're doing. We're building software to extract money from marketplaces and store it in share price. And that's a strange thing to be using all of this technological know-how to do.
So you paint a pretty compelling picture of the impact of capitalism, for centuries and how it affects the digital economy today. But when you were talking about the Middle Ages, for example, I was thinking about what was happening in some other non-European parts of the world at the time who were not necessarily colonizing, they were expanding. So for example, feudal Russia and feudal China. And it's perhaps not entirely historical accident that those countries wound up for a period of time in their histories experimenting with communism rather than capitalism. So how do you think those countries and just the existence of this not necessarily parallel but distinct economic structure is going to affect and is already affecting the digital age?
It's interesting. I mean, I feel like in a digital age we have more room for the retrieval of some of these alternative models. You know, one of them I was looking at, I don't talk about that much, but was the Arab millet system. They had a completely different currency system than we did, you know, and we were the Crusaders going there. But the Crusader, we had a colonial mandate because we had to grow our economy. When they didn't have a colonial mandate, as China say, they end up looking at things with a much longer term strategy. I mean, China now, why would China care more about global warming, say, than America would? Because China's economic model is bounded. You know, they think of themselves as the empire, but they're not. It's not about becoming global. It's about China as this thing. The millet system, which was a whole other currency system in the Arab world, the millet, you don't grow your money. It was a sustainable money that stayed at the same value, or even had demurrage. It even devalued over time, and different localities could really generate as much money as they needed to accomplish their economic goals. Not that the Arab world is doing totally great philosophically right now.
Right. So to follow up on that, in that same vein, I mean, do you not agree with the sort of the Western mentality that we're taught that all of those experiments have failed or are failing? I mean, you know, we tend to think, I mean, obviously Russia is, whatever. And then I'm Russian, so I'm allowed to say it, but I won't. And then, the Arab world is, is experiencing cultural issues and sort of, religious extremism, et cetera. And, China is, in the United States, we're not necessarily taught by our mentality that China is doing well. We're taught that it's going to fail.
Right.
So
well, now that we're going to fail, it's going to be interesting. Now that we're just one of everybody, it's an interesting moment. But you know who got asked that question, interestingly enough, was the Pope got asked that question. Not this one, but one right after Marx. The Pope was asked, well, do you agree with Marx about the worker, or do you agree with the capitalist? And the Pope's trying to be global. And the Pope came up with a different economic model he called distributism. And the idea with distributism was that no business should be bigger than it needs to be in order to serve its function. So you don't grow for growth's sake. A business becomes as big as it needs to be to do what it does, and then if someone else wants to do that business, then they do it somewhere else. If it's going to scale, it's going to scale laterally by other people. The other idea of distributism, what the Pope said was, the object of the game is not to redistribute the spoils of capitalism after the fact. What we do is pre-distribute the means of production before the fact. So distributism held that the worker should own the means of production. The worker should own his own tools, or the cab driver should, by inference, the cab driver should own Uber instead of working for Uber. And it's an interesting model, and one that I don't think worked then, but is actually one that could work now. That's why I'm hopeful that a digital economy could be distributist in its nature. So if we own the platform through platform cooperativism, then we end up with, I mean, what if the YouTubers owned YouTube? I mean, it's when it gets to that place, you start thinking, oh, the Pope maybe understood something. And Pope Francis, for the first time in, God knows, 100 years, he retrieved some of the language from that original kind of distributist manifesto in the last thing, Laudato Si, his little treatise, because he understands that distributism at least is an economic model that doesn't depend on the destruction of the planet.
Thank you. We're running out of time. So we have some books. You can get there. They're subsidized. And I think Douglas is going to stay around. If you have more questions, you can come and ask some questions. So again, thank you for coming. Thanks.